to understand the questions of intersectionality as they relate to religion and to theology, and particularly to have a well-written, laid out, interestingly constructed book to bring people on board in this very difficult time. So I want to welcome all of you and welcome them in particular. I want to remind you that some of the wonderful talks that we've had already this year with Dr. Gail Yee on Hebrew Bible, Catherine Lofton on Consuming Religion, and Diane New on her recently published liturgy book, Stirring Waters, can be accessed on our website if you look under the WATERTalks section. And you'll find there both the notes that we take for these talks as well as the audio recordings. This is the first time we've used Zoom. Diane's audio recording isn't up yet, but will be shortly. But this is the first time we've used Zoom. And we've been using it for a lot of programs this season for reasons that remain obvious. And I think people are liking it so much that this will become the normative way of doing water programs. It has the advantage of having people not only see one another, which is all kinds of fun, but also having access both in terms of telephone as well as on internet. And we want to be very clear that everyone is welcome. And the point is to make these programs accessible. Not everyone can go to theological school or study religion, but most people have access at least to a phone or to a computer, and therefore we at Water try to socialize resources so that you can share them. Once this program is over, you can also access it yourself on our website. Use it with your classes, use it with your colleagues, use it with your congregation. And the way this works is that it's a win-win for everyone. The speakers, of course, are very generous with their time and talent. The publishers are also happy because we hope that we help them sell books. And we are all happy because we learn a lot. And especially as we move forward in this time, it's quite clear that we need new resources, and we need resources that are helpful in terms of a wide variety of people and not, as we'll talk about today, siloed or pigeonholed in terms of one particular point of view. So with that, let me simply say a little bit about water and why we're having this particular talk. Like all of our efforts, our purpose today is social change as well as intellectual stimulation. Susan and Grace's book is a good example of engaged scholarship. As the many dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrate, we're not all in the same boat. Rather, the many socioeconomic and cultural factors that shape our reality, in which some are privileged and others are oppressed, are playing out worldwide on your television all day long. More people will die of hunger this season than from coronavirus. Communities of color and those who are poor are paying the highest price, while those of us who continue apace in the comfort of our own homes are really being inconvenienced. So these intersectional matters require our attention, hence the choice, the very happy choice of this book for this day and these colleagues for today's session. I must say, and I say this especially to Susan and Grace, when we envisioned this last summer, in the summertime at Water, we planned the programs for the whole year, we never, in our wildest imaginations, envisioned this moment. So there is something very fortuitous about our being together and you being our speakers today, because I think we need your work now more than ever. So let me simply say, for those who are new, the format. We begin with an introduction of the speakers, which I will make shortly. Grace and Susan will have 20 to 25 minutes to lay out the contours of their book. Again, I want to bring it to your attention. Intersectional Theology, an introductory guide published by Fortress. And then when they finish, we'll have an opportunity to open the discussion. And so you'll have an opportunity to ask your question or to make your comment. And Laura will see to it that our audio is muted throughout the presentation so we get a good clear line, and then you're able to use this in a very helpful way because you're not going to be listening to people's doorbells ring and their cats meow. When our speakers finish and you join, we'll give you instructions on how to raise your hand and to get recognized so that you can be in the queue for asking questions. So with that introduction, let me simply say that we will end at 2 p.m., which is Eastern time to respect everybody's schedules. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you can simply refer to our website to listen to this again. Our focus today is a book that I think many people will find useful moving forward as we try to understand and, most importantly, change the conditions of inequality that we see playing out in relief during the pandemic. This book is a good way to help yourself and your students, your parishioners, your community members move into the complex needs of our time with information and with some creative suggestions. Let me introduce Grace Ji-Sun Kim, Professor of Theology at Earlham School of Religion. She's ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA. She writes prolifically in many media, and she's the author of Mother-Daughter Speak. Among other topics, she writes about the experience of Korean immigrant women to North America, paralleling her own experience, as she describes in this book, her early life in Korea, a move as a child to Canada, and eventually to the US, where she now lives in Indiana. Susan Shaw is Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State University. She's the author of Reflective Faith, a theological toolbox for women. Susan grew up and was educated in the Southern Baptist tradition. She's now an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. Her research interests have included women in HIV/AIDS, as well as women in rock music. She's the general editor of a new encyclopedia on women, and she blogs for Huffington Post. And I did hear earlier today from a colleague that I had, who is not able to be with us, but who said that she had read the article about this book on Huffington Post. So obviously people read it. Let me simply conclude by saying how Water blurbed this book. You know, another place on our website, we have a section called What We're Reading. And here's what we wrote about this book last year. How life experiences influence understandings of the divine is a critical question when using intersectionality as a theological method. The authors of this book describe the origins of intersectionality and connect it to the wisdom of liberation theologians. They point out the important tension that comes with honoring multiple perspectives, leading readers to embrace nuance as crucial, humanity as complex, and the importance of social location in theological studies. Not a simple task. So I introduce Susan and Grace to Not a Simple Task, but I hope that you'll join me in listening carefully to their presentation and engaging them in conversation. Thank you to Grace and Susan for being with us.
Thanks, Mary. Grace and I are going to tag team it a little bit and talk informally about the book. And, we're most excited about, hearing from folks and getting questions and responding to those. And so, Grace, I thought I would start off and talk about how the book came to be. And then, we'll just kind of see where it goes from there. It'll be very spontaneous. But before I do that, I did want to publicly congratulate Grace on her promotion to full professor, which just came through not too long ago. So congratulations, Grace.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you.
So years ago, I was teaching a course here at Oregon State University on feminist theologies, and I had selected Grace's book on Sophia for one of the textbooks. And one of my colleagues in ethnic studies, Robert Thompson, saw that I was using that book, and Robert said, "Oh, I've met Grace. Would you want to see if we could bring her here?" And I thought, oh, this is brilliant. So that worked out, and I brought Grace to campus, and she spoke in my classes and met my colleagues and met my students, and we just hit it off. And so then we spent the next several years talking about what can we do together? We want to do something together. And then Grace would have another book project because she's one of the most prolific writers I have ever known. And then I'd have something, and then I went into administration, which was its own living nightmare. And then finally we had this moment where we both had some space to do a new project. And we started talking about it, and we hit on this notion of intersectionality, which of course in women, gender, and sexuality studies we've been talking about for decades, but not so much in theology. And so Grace and I scrambled and looked and really didn't find anything that was addressing intersectionality seriously as an analytical tool to move forward the mission of theology. And so we thought, well, why not us? And so we started traveling back and forth and meeting up when we can and doing a lot of work online. And across, what was it, a year and a half, we wrote the book and got a publisher and came out with it. And so Grace, why don't you take it from there, maybe talk a little bit about some of the foundational pieces of the book, and I'll just chime in wherever you'd like, and we'll just go back and forth.
Yep, sure. Thank you so much, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to say thank you to Mary. I think this is my second, third, or fourth Water Talk, and I'm actually enjoying every one. And you know, this one I'm so excited about because it is through Zoom. When I did it on the phone, it was so hard. I didn't know who was on the other side, but now I can see some faces. So this is wonderful. And thank you to Laura for making this all possible. So thank you for the invite and for that wonderful introduction to our book, and to Susan and I, and for the blurb that you guys wrote on the book last year. So as Susan said, you know, we're so excited about this book. And you know, she gave the introduction of how we met and where how we wrote the book. And I just want to say, the book came out, I thought it was last year, but I have the copy of the book. It came out 2018. And since then, I've been writing some articles or blogs or another book thing. And I can't, I do quote myself a lot, but I can't stop quoting the book because I think I came up with the thought yesterday. I think all roads lead to intersectionality. I think because yesterday I did a talk via Zoom because, you know, we're all in shutdown for Presbyterian Church, First Presbyterian Church in Ann Arbor on climate justice. And I couldn't stop referencing intersectional theology because I think all roads, whatever we're dealing with, whatever justice issue that we're dealing with today, will lead to some form of intersectionality, because today we don't live on an island by ourselves. We never did. We recognize that everything intersects. So we as men, women, trans, queer, straight, whoever we are, there is this intersectionality. And as Susan kind of mentioned, you know, and I'm in theology and Susan is in gender studies, sexuality studies. They've been using this intersectionality tool for a long time. Theology, we recognize, and I recognize, that we haven't been using this tool. As a liberation theologian, I have been looking at, you know, from the 1960s, with the rise of liberation theology, with feminist theology, Latin American theology, womanist, Asian American, you know, we've been using different kind of tools to kind of work towards liberation and towards justice. But then, you know, I was kind of at this crossroad where it still wasn't taking into consideration all of who I am and all of who everyone is, whether it be gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, education, ableism, and all the other aspects of what makes us who we are. And so Susan and I, you know, using the gender studies tools on intersectionality, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who kind of began using this term intersectionality to understand how we understand ourselves and our situations, and how we can kind of move forward so that we can work towards some form of social justice. So that's why I kind of think now, you know, it came out 2 years ago, but I just keep quoting myself and Susan all the time. Everything I've been doing and all the talks, most of my talks, kind of leads to intersectional theology. So I'll just kind of stop there, and Susan can kind of carry on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Grace and I tried to highlight with intersectionality is what it really is as it emerged from Black feminism. Because I think there's this sort of pop culture understanding of intersectionality as simply identity, that I'm this, and this. But really, intersectionality is about how those identities come together within structures of power. And so it's not simply the intersection of my own race, gender, sexuality, etc., but it's also the intersections of the systems of racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, and so forth. And so when we think about intersectionality as an analytical tool, it means then that we're looking at whatever the phenomenon is in front of us and asking how are those systems of power at play in very different ways depending on those sort of intersecting identities. And so it's like, how is it that, for example, Grace and I experience sexism differently based on our differing identities? And so in the book, one of the central pieces is the importance of narrative. And so Grace and I actually start off and we tell our stories side by side so that you can really begin to see how those identities played out and were affected by the system of oppression in which they were located. And I think then we were able to start asking those questions of theology, because we all know, I mean, theology mostly has been been done by, you know, educated, privileged, straight white men, and it's been done as if they can speak for everybody. And so what Grace and I wanted to do is to bring this tool to theology to say that each of us from our own social locations within these systems of power has something to contribute to the theological conversation that is just as valid as that long history of what straight white men have had to tell us. Grace, you just jump in whenever.
I think the power that Susan is mentioning is so crucial to how we understand intersectional theology. So looking at who holds power and how power can be misused. So just a quick outline, the contents, you know, there's only 6 chapters. So introduction to the intersectionality, biography, as, you know, understanding who we are is so important. You know, I always just identified as an Asian American theologian, but the feminist, the woman part is important, the education, the socioeconomic status, and the fact that I'm able, all these, you know, the ableism I never really considered, or the ageism I never kind of considered, but this, I don't know, I'm hearing music. I'm not, am I the only one hearing music?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't hear it.
Yes, we're not hearing it. We're fine. Go ahead.
Oh, you're not hearing it? Okay. I don't know how I'm hearing music.
It might be another window on your computer or on your phone or something. Is there another window open in your phone?
No, I closed everything, so I'm not sure where the music was coming from. But anyway,
angels, clearly.
Okay, okay, I'll just, Susan, can you just carry on? I want to see, I've got all my kids at home.
All right, go ahead and check on that. So Grace was talking about the table of contents, and so we start off with an introduction, and we begin by tracing the history of intersectionality within Black feminism, because we think it's really crucial to make that connection, to realize that this idea arose from the lived experiences of a particular group of people who articulated it, and then, you know, its application has been much broader, but it always needs to be rooted in Black feminism. Then we talk about biography as intersectional theology, and that's where we put our stories side by side. So Grace is a straight Asian woman, me as a white lesbian from the South, you know, and both of us grew up in fairly working class kinds of homes where the role of class plays an important part, particularly in our growing up. And Grace grew up in you know, Korean Presbyterian tradition. I grew up a Southern Baptist fundamentalist. And when you put those stories side by side, you really begin to see how these systems of power made a difference for us, and how we had different experiences of similar phenomena based on our identities within those systems of power. Then we talk about intersectionality as theological method. And what we do is we take the work, particularly of Vivian May, Patricia Hill Collins, and Surma Bilge, and Ange, oh, and I just lost her last name, Hancock, Ange Marie Hancock, and we take the questions that they use to outline intersectional theology, and we intersectionality, and we apply those specifically to theology. Then we talk about how we apply intersectionality to the Bible, and so we use it as a lens for biblical interpretation. And then finally, we turn our lens to practical theology and think about, what does this mean for the church itself? And so we try to develop a small slice of intersectional ecclesiology in the final chapter. And then we really issue sort of, I think, a call for theologians, both professional and lay theologians, to include intersectionality as a primary theological method, and to quit acting as if I can theologize for other people from my social location as if their social location doesn't affect their understandings of theology. Are you back, Grace?
Yeah, I'm back now, and I apologize. I hope you didn't hear me yelling at my 3 kids. So I don't know how they're playing games or something. I have 2 came home from college and one's in high school. And so I told everybody to not disturb me for 1 hour. But anyway, I apologize if you heard any weird music or me telling my kids to get off.
Not to
Whatever they
worry,
were playing.
we all have families. Go ahead.
So my apologies. And I got kicked out of my own office and because my son came home and now I'm in my bedroom. So I'm so sorry, but thank you, Susan, for jumping in and for filling in. I didn't hear much of what you were saying, but I'll just continue on to what I was saying. I'm going through the contents.
Well, I finished.
And so
I went through the table of contents,
oh,
Grace.
okay, sorry. Yeah, so thank you. So I think understanding our own identities and where we fit in our identities is so crucial in how we do theology. You know, I think theology is biography and biography is theology. We understand God from understanding our own selves and through our own lives and our experiences. So in my intro to theology class, one of the simple assignments I ask students to do is a theological reflection piece from their own particular experience. When we study the 2,000 years of particularly Christian theology, as Susan had mentioned, it's written by white men, most likely all straight white men. And people will continue to argue with folks like me saying, oh, they never wrote out of their context or their biography or their experience. But if you don't even have to read carefully. You know, from reading Augustine, reading Anselm or Luther, every single one of them wrote from their own particular experience as a white male. So we know people understand God from their own particular experience, from their own particular context. And that is basically the only way we can understand God. God is this infinite and we are finite and our languages are so limited. You know, I always say to my students, you know, language is so important. It defines how we think, it forms how our thoughts even. You know, and theology is just a bunch of words. We don't have anything else. You know, my kids are in sciences, at least they have labs or they have material things that they can go and study and do scientific kind of analysis using their hands or whatever it is. But as theologians and those of us, people of faith, whatever faith tradition we belong to, it's basically our experiences and our words. So I think introducing intersectionality to our theological discourse kind of opens up our minds, opens up our thoughts and imagination. You know, when Susan and I were writing this, we heard kind of that someone else was writing intersectional theology. And so we were even kind of under the gun to write it faster because we wanted to be the first ones as women to kind of put it out there. And I don't think there has been another book. So someone was kind of just saying stuff. But I actually think more people should write on this because it's this lens that kind of opens up this analysis that we can do, give us new lens, give us new ways of talking about theology. And we talk about multi-axis. You know, for a long time, theologians had this single axis of doing theology, but intersectionality opens it up and recognizes that there is this multiple ways, multiple lenses that helps us understand God and how God interacts in our lives. You know, and I think for so long, theologians have excluded women's voices, and particularly women of color voices or people of color. So it was white male. But I think the more voices that come, you know, trans voices, queer voices, women of color voices that have been excluded, the better that we understand our own experiences of who we are and how we can reimagine God, because we're so finite, and the more voices, the more languages, and that's why even as an Korean American woman theologian, I use languages from Asia. So I think people can use African words and South American and whatever concepts and languages, because these all help us. And that's what intersectionality is about. All these ideas kind of come together and intersect, and it can open up our minds and our ideas to come to a better understanding of ourselves, and better understanding of people of faith, and better understanding of who God is in our lives.
Yeah, one of the critiques of intersectionality has been that it, by focusing on each individual experience, divides us up into ever smaller units of people till we're down to just the individual. But I actually see that as one of the strengths of intersectionality. And I think that's what Grace has been talking about as well, is that because each of us has a different little piece, we need all the pieces. And so there's a certain humility also that comes with intersectionality, to recognize that I've only got one little piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece, but it's only my piece, and I need everybody else's piece. And when we're missing that perspective of other people, then there are insights about the divine that we're missing. And Grace also touched on two of the concepts that are really important in intersectionality are these notions of ambiguity and simultaneity. And so in suggesting we need to do intersectionality, we're asking people to live in ambiguity and to recognize that all this stuff is always happening at the same time, and we just have to deal with that complexity in our theology. And so we can't, as Grace said, simply focus on gender or race or sexuality, which is what I think a lot of historical theologies have done. I think that womanist theology was really the first, again, because intersectionality, I think, arose out of Black feminism, was the first to begin to do that in very important ways. And I think now you've got womanist theologians who are queer coming along, and they're also adding that into the mix to call us to think about it in even more complex ways. And so I think what intersectionality demands of us is that we have this multi-axis thinking. And so that I'm always imagining, how is this seen through this lens of gender, race, class, ability? And I explain it to my students, is we're not talking about sort of discrete categories, because gender never exists apart from race or apart from sexuality. And I use the analogy of paint. And so you sort of have red paint and blue paint, and when you pour them together, you get purple paint, which is neither red nor blue, and it's more than just the sum of red and blue. And I think that's what intersectionality helps us understand, is that it's not just additive, so race plus gender plus sexuality, but that as they come together, it's like the confluence of a river, where they flow together and they shape each other into something new. The Black feminists talk about this, particularly Vivian May, as both and, that we have to have a both and vision, that things can be both this and that. And sometimes the both and calls us to have conflicting and competing ideas in mind at the same time without having to invalidate any of them. So you can see, I mean, I've come a long way from my fundamentalist roots.
We both, if you read the book, you will see that we both kind of grew up in the fundamentalist evangelical churches, and we've kind of moved on from there. But I think, Susan, what you're saying, it's in the book, and it's so important, and the ambiguity, and that theology is messy. I think for a long time, the white male kept thinking it's so clean, it's all, I present God and here you go, and this is the doctrine of the Trinity, and let it be, but we recognize as the more you do this, the more messy it gets. Nothing is very clear, and the ambiguity, as a student or as people of faith and those who are leading faith traditions, we feel kind of unsafe. But that's an okay place to be in this ambiguous space, and understanding that theology is messy. And so that then helps us. We go through some of the ways you can understand theology, doing intersectionality for theology and for Bible and for the church. I think today, and I also, before I get into church and the theology and Bible, I also wanted to say what Susan was saying about, now I kind of lost my train of thought. Oh, the both and. I think Western Christianity, the disservice that we did, Western Christianity has made it a dualistic way of thinking, a dualistic theology through much of our 2,000 years of our Christian history. And that has been a very big disservice. So we have man and woman, word and wisdom, heaven and earth, matter and spirit. But if you look at different other religions and other kind of Eastern thought, which, I was born in Korea, and I didn't grow up in Korea, but I grew up in Canada. But having this mixed identity and this hybridity that's been part of me and trying to work that out has made me recognize that this both and is such an important way of doing theology, that it shouldn't be so separate. And, for all of my, whenever I, through my PhD studies and much of my own kind of work, everything was so dualistic. The spirit and matter especially was very problematic to me. How Christianity has separated spirit and matter. So matter is bad. Anything to do with the body. That's why, you can do bad, when scripture's talking about don't do these bad things, don't be full of pride and whatever that has to do with non-sexuality things. But when someone commits some sexuality sin, that's why we can't even talk about sexuality very well in the church, because it feels like it's this matter thing. And so, the United Church is probably going to divide because they can't do the full inclusion. We Presbyterians, PCUSA said, yes, we can do full inclusion, but then so many churches have left, because when it comes to do with sexuality, people get so uptight because it has to do with body and matter. But people can be full of pride and no one kicks them out of the church. Most of us church leaders are full of pride, but nobody kicks us out. But when it has to do with matter, so my point is, we've divided. This dualism has been so harmful, because whenever it has to do with our body, we can't reconcile that body and matter and spirit are all intertwined. It has to be looked at it that way, that the spirit and matter is part of who we are and part of what the creation was and part of the earth. Then we wouldn't be so uptight about sexuality in our churches, particularly in our churches. So uptight about this that we kick people out and we exclude people. But once we recognize, and that has to tie in with the spirit too, the language of chi that I use recognizes and makes us recognize that chi is in us and the spirit is in us. So it's not this dualistic, the split. And that's what intersectionality wants to do, that it's not so split up. There is this both and that needs to happen, that we need to recognize. And that's such a good tool when we're reading scripture and when we're doing theology and when we're doing ministry in the church, that it's not so split up, that there's both and today, particularly in the American context, immigrants are coming, refugees are coming, the climate refugees, political, religious refugees, people are migrating and immigrating. It's much easier today than it was 50 years ago. And when cultures clash and cultures are coming together, we need to reimagine church. So one of the ways is this intercultural way of being church, and understanding that intersectionality is going to be crucial in how we reimagine church and how we become church today and in the future. And so this, it's not a very big book. It's, big in size, but it's not a very long book. So someone can actually sit there and read it in one day, 120 something pages. So I'm hoping that this will be a good tool for those who are in the ministry or those who are leading faith group traditions, of how you can reimagine how you can be a new body of Christ or a new faith body. Because I know you have interfaith people listening, and those who will be listening after the recording. So even interfaith, how can we come together, as people of faith, fighting racism, fighting sexism, fighting climate change? Because the tools that are set in this book will help us kind of reimagine how we can go forward in this world where things are clashing, ambiguity exists, theology is messy, and this both and must exist as we're doing theology.
Thank you so very much to both of you for this wonderful introduction to a very important topic, intersectional theology. And let me say once again that the book is available from Fortress Press. It's a 2018 Fortress Press book, Intersectionality, Intersectional Theology, an Introductory Guide. And I would recommend it, as Grace has just said, for especially for working groups. And they need not be in the Christian tradition. They can be from a variety of religious traditions or none whatsoever. And that's where I want to move our questions. What are some of the practical ways in which this kind of work can be implemented, both in religious circles, but perhaps more importantly in political and social circles? So with that, I want to thank both Susan and Grace for the book, for the presentation. And I want to invite now other people to ask questions, make comments. And the way you're going to do this is you're going to unmute your audio when it's your turn and say your name so we know who you are. If you would like to speak, put your hand up like this. If we see you, great. If we don't, we will keep track down on the where your video. Laura, why don't you explain this, because you're better at this than I am. The video and how you can raise your hand there.
If you want to raise your hand via Zoom to participate, if you click on the bottom bar under all the pictures where it says mute, stop video, you would click on the participants button, and that will open a white bar on the side or a pop-up window. And there should be a button underneath all the participants that says raise hand. So if you click that, I'll know that you have a question to ask and we can make sure that muting happens. If you can't find that button, you can also just wave your hand on the screen and I'll try and keep track of everyone as Mary moderates.
Or in the worst case, you can also put it into the chat and say, help, it's me. Or as we used to say in Catholic school, stir, stir, stir. That was sister, but we said it so quickly, it was stir, stir. So, so I see a few Catholics laughing at this. You also said stir. The boys would beat their chests and say, stir, stir. They wanted to answer the question. They were sure they were right, but there you go. Put your hands up if you'd like to ask a question. I also want to suggest that this is the kind of topic that pushes us to political discussion, so that's helpful too. And I'll ask the first question just to prime the pump here, and that is, I wonder what you think of the 1992 work of Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza when she introduced the concept of kyriarchy, because that's really where I first came across this notion in her book, But She Said, the book on biblical interpretation. And when she talked about kyriarchy, she said that kyriarchy was interstructured forms of lordship, that kyrie or Lord was really a problem, not a positive thing in this particular regard in terms of structures of lordship, racism, sexism, class issues. We'd add xenophobia, transphobia, etc. I just wonder how, if that played a role, because it seems to me that that's one of the first places, especially in feminist work and religion, where this concept of intersectionality came forward. And that was already in 1992. So I just wonder what you think.
Yeah, we do quote Elizabeth in the book, and I can't remember if it was from that book or not.
No,
I think
you quoted her about something else, I think, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, and I think, you know, this way of thinking, you know, before the book came out, I knew that I was thinking in this way, that these structures, the Lord that you, the kyriarchy that Fiorenza is talking about, people have been using these concepts. I think, you know, earlier I talked about language. The language opens up our minds, and I thought, so bringing the intersectionality term into theology helps us in this discussion. So I think there have been many thinkers, our forerunners of the feminist theologians have been kind of talking about this in different ways and forms. And now Susan and I just want to give this kind of term into theology. I always find theology is a little slow. So, you just look at post-colonial theology. It came decades after post-colonial studies was kind of booming and going. So I think theology is always slower, and then church is slower than theology too. So we're hoping that as theologians and as leaders kind of talk about it and using this term, because this term is very helpful, because now it's not just people in gender studies that are using this term. You know, people around are now continuing to use this in different places in political studies and so forth. So we're just trying to say, let's use it within the theological studies.
Right.
And hopefully biblical studies will use it too. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah.
one of the things I've always appreciated about Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza is her ability to be reflective about the places where she wasn't always aware of how issues of race or sexuality, or very recently empire, have shaped her own thinking. And so what I found most helpful kind of in the background is sort of thinking about these notions of empire. And I think she was an early feminist writing, you know, from post-colonial perspectives. And I noticed in the Zoom group chat, somebody had asked the question about nation, and absolutely that's a piece of it. And so I think part of what we have to attend to is the history of empire and sort of the ongoing project of imperialism. And so I appreciate that piece of her as well, that's really taken the notion of empire seriously, as well as these other forms of intersections.
Great. Okay, floor is open. Thank you. Let's open the floor. Whoever would like to speak, raise your hand or indicate through the Zoom way. Yes, please go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
Janet, I'm sorry, I can't find the right button, but what I wanted to ask is two quick things. I was really wondering if you give a very brief definition of intersectionality. I think I know what it means, but I haven't read your book, and it's been a while since I've read in the theology because I've been retired and my eyes aren't quite what they used to be. And the other thing is, I was intrigued your very brief comments about ageism and intersectionality. I think that must have a great deal to do if you're in your, say, your 20s in writing or in your 80s in writing, and vice versa. I'd just be curious about your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet Board from Ohio.
Yes,
So I'll read the definition from the book since I have it right in front of me, and then I can say what it really means. So the definition we use for the book, we said intersectionality is a tool for analysis that takes into account the simultaneously experienced multiple social locations, identities, and institutions that shape individual and collective experience within hierarchically structured systems of power and privilege. What all that means is that it's something that we use to examine phenomena so that we're looking at the same time for the ways these various systems of power, privilege, and difference are operating in ways that maintain hierarchies. And so one of the things that we didn't say earlier is that another piece of intersectionality is that it is always focused towards social justice. And so that's always behind it. It's not simply analysis for the sake of analysis, but it's analysis to move us forward to a more just world. And then, Rachel, are you still there? You disappeared.
Yes, I am. And I was trying to.
You're muted.
Okay, well, let's go ahead with some more questions then. I'm going to turn to Matt, and then after Matt will be Allison, and after Allison will be Oliva. So Matt, Allison, and Oliva. Go ahead in that order.
Thank you. Susan and Grace, thank you for the wonderful book. I'm curious, when you encounter students who may be a little suspicious or a little maybe reserved about entering into this space and engaging it, what are some strategies you use to disarm them? Because I'm thinking about students, but I'm also thinking about church faith communities. How do you disarm people so they can kind of own this multiple facet of who they are?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you so much for that question, but I'll just assure them that this is something probably what you've been doing already, but not concretely recognizing it. I began the presentation today saying all roads lead to intersectionality. People, I think, do recognize, this climate change and political justice and racial justice are kind of intertwined, but to give this kind of language will be helpful. So I think you can just kind of push them in saying, you probably have been doing this, explore the book or explore this way of thinking to kind of widen and give language to what you have been already doing or what the church may have been doing. And for those that have never been doing this, maybe it's a good way as we move forward, as we fight all these, racism, xenophobia, all these homophobia, etc. Susan, you can add.
Well, one of the best pieces of advice I got when I came out of seminary and started teaching religion was when you're dealing with controversial things, in this case it was teaching Hebrew Bible, it was let them discover it for themselves. And so very often when I'm teaching something I think they're going to resist, I start with activities that let them discover the theory. I come back and say, oh, we have a name for this. In this case, it's intersectionality.
Great. Go ahead, Allison. You'll be next.
Hi there. So I hope you're hearing me.
We are. Thank you.
Great. So I have to say that I am a social scientist. I'm a sociologist and anthropologist, not a theologian, but I kind of like to pretend like I am occasionally. But what I wanted to kind of maybe explore a bit is because I think, again, my experience as an immigrant, post-Vatican II child, now living in the South, you know, trying to kind of grapple with this idea of the church that I grew up with in the Caribbean being, I think, in my experience, biography again, in my experience, being very kind of open and not that we didn't follow rules, but the rigidity of which I see these rules being applied to sometimes here makes me want to pull out my hair. And so, you know, I think one of the things that I'd like us to, I often talk to my students about is this difference between the kind of Euro-focused church, right, where all the rules are written and, you know, the hierarchy lives, as opposed to the lived experience of people in their communities, right? So, you know, the church where, yeah, everybody needs to, you know, people should be married before they make babies. Well, that just doesn't happen in the real world, right? And so how does that happen? So I think that I think is something that's, it's not just when we talk about intersectionality in the social sciences, we tend to focus on race, gender, and class, and more sexuality or sexual identity, but also this kind of, I guess, the historic context, right? The historic context, the difference between a colonized people and the colonizer. And that even in the United States, people are, you know, have been colonized and continue to be colonized. So that was what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Any comments on that, either of our speakers?
Well, I think the intersectionality needs to take into consideration colonialism. You know, America, you know, the white settlers had taken over the Native Americans. So they take it over the land and genocide happens. So looking at all those and the intersectionality of that. But today in 2020, we are the colonizers, Americans. You know, we are building the empire. We go and colonize other countries. So we need to take into all those considerations. So yes, the political aspect, the social aspect, all this gender, race, ethnicity, those things all need to be taken into consideration, and understanding the power dynamics is crucial. So thank you for raising those different points as a sociologist. Thank you.
Great. Let's go on to Oliva. Oliva Speen, are you still with us? Yeah, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I had to unmute. Okay, so I wanted to, you know, like Allison, I'm not a theologian. I have been working on intersectionality since the late 80s, early 90s from psychology. And so I want to corroborate a number of these things and sort of share what it's made me think about. The importance of language and sexuality. I did a big study of immigrant women from all over the world that was published in a book in 1999. And one of the things I talked about was the importance of language to evoke sexual feelings, and we could say spiritual feelings and etc. And there's an article that appeared in Women and Therapy about women immigrants. And the title of the article is Making Love in English, because one of the women I interviewed said she could not make love in English. So, okay. So that was, and there are lots, speaking of intersectionality, even when you're working with a population of only immigrant women, there's so many differences in terms of social class, in terms of race, in terms of accent, in terms of, you know, ages, levels of education. We think immigrant women and we think poor Mexican women who clean houses. And there's much more than that, including Grace and I and Allison and many others. So it's a rich field there. And I've been playing theologian recently. I did a book on women saints, but basically I'm a psychologist. So from psychological points of view, of course, intersectionality is enormously important because it's your biography, it's who you are, it's how you feel about yourself. So this is absolutely essential to understand human beings from all kinds of perspectives. So thank you for doing this presentation and writing this book. I'm gonna look for it. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for that.
So much. Who else would like to make a comment or ask a question? Please. Yes, Tashika Rhodes from Wesley Theological Seminary, and then Ann Winslow. Go ahead, Tashika.
Yes, while I've been interning at the Water office, I've become acquainted with the womanist theology. This is something new for me, new waters. And I just wanted to clarify and make sure that I heard you right when you said that the intersectionality in regards to theology derived from the womanist theology. Is that correct?
So what I said was that I think womanist theology was one of the earliest forms of theology to begin to do intersectional work.
Okay.
And it's continued to evolve. So now that you have womanist theology, we're also examining sexuality in more detail. Yeah. So I think that there's a close connection. Yeah.
Close connection, but not derived. The derived one. Yeah, but it is the Black thinkers that kind of we use, Kimberly Crenshaw, that we bring into the book because they then brought it into the public sphere to use this kind of way of thinking, intersectionality. Yeah.
Kimberly Crenshaw was out of law, and most of the other people we use are actually out of either women and gender studies or sociology.
Yeah.
And we just blurbed. I don't think it's come out yet, but we at Water just blurbed the new Patricia Hill Collins book on intersectionality. Patricia Hill Collins being professor emerita at University of Maryland, and again in the social sciences. So we just blurbed that for a forthcoming what we're reading, and that is really, I think, in many ways a very very complicated and in the best sense of the word, thorough treatment of this question across the board in the sciences, and that really raises other questions about how this is working both in religion, Grace, and how religion's working, Susan, in your area. So those would be interesting topics for another time. Tashika, were you finished?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, and then Ann Winslow will be next. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann from Lancaster, and I was just wondering if anything has been done. I work a lot with survivors of sexual and domestic violence with intersectionality, and so many of us have, had horrible experiences in church, and I was just wondering if there's anything positive that's being done.
That's our next book. Thank you.
We've been working on that right now, so hoping to get it done. But that is our next book because that is so crucial. The intersectionality and understanding this Church Too movement, and that what leads to, the sexual assault and the sexual crimes, that is all with the intersectionality.
Thank you so much.
And just to answer your question in a very proximate way, not tomorrow when we'll have Rita Brock and Kwok Pui Lam and Mary Condren with us for tea at 2:00, but next week on Tuesday for Water's Tea on Tuesday, we will have with us Reverend Dr. Marie Marshall Fortune as well as Emily Cohen from the Faith Trust Institute. And I think those are two people whose work you'll find very important. I hope you'll join us for that. I'd like to go to Sylvia and then to Anne.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good
Are you
afternoon,
here?
Sylvia.
Yes. Thank you for this wonderful discussion about intersectionality. But as a tool of analysis, what I want to throw out here is that when we approach work as analysts and researchers, we have certain embedded assumptions, or we are supposed to declare assumptions. So I was wondering, Grace and Susan, what were your assumptions when you began this work? What are you thinking about the human being? Because those of us who grew up, let's say, in the Catholic Church, you know, from birth, you understand all human beings are made by God. And in a way, as you grow older and you meet the different divisions in society, you wonder, well, if all of us are made by God, why am I despised by A group? Why am I excluded from B group? You know, so I'm thinking that it all sounds good, but there is a whole foundation of maybe ambiguity, to use Grace's term, or of not recognizing really that what are our assumptions about each other, what are our assumptions about human beings.
Good.
So I agree with Susan about, you know, what were their underlying presuppositions as they began to work on this analytical tool.
Thanks. And then we'll have time for one more question. So go ahead, Susan and Grace, and then there'll be one last question by Mary Jelinek, and then sadly we'll have to end our time together. Go ahead, Susan.
I think that some of our assumptions were that, you know, we're sort of broken people in a broken system, and the system keeps reproducing itself and breaking all of us. And that within that, however, the hope is, to use theological language, for redemption. That just because it's been this way, it doesn't have to continue to be this way, but there has to be intervention and restructuring in the system for that to happen. And not just on an individual personal level in my heart, but also on a structural level, so that these systems, and I think the pandemic has made this so clear, that the systems are so broken at a structural level that they have to be reshaped if we want to address these social inequalities that keep reproducing our brokenness. So I think that, at least for me, that kind of informed this work, and that intersectionality is the tool that helps me begin to unravel all those pieces to understand what's broken and why it's broken and how we redeem it.
Thank you. Grace?
Just, you know, everybody do have assumptions. So, you know, as I teach, I always say, you know, you're here in seminary, we deconstruct you, and then we try to reconstruct, or you reconstruct your own way of thinking. So we, you know, as we're writing, we had to do a lot of deconstructing, a lot of self-examination, seeing what assumptions we're bringing and lay it out, and try to work through that as we try to kind of come up with this theology. I always think of theology as this kind of imaginative, kind of creative task. So we lay down our assumptions and try to move forward, because there are all these powers and all these assumptions that kind of want to push us down, particularly women of color down. So we try to work through that and work towards some meaningful and hopeful way of rethinking theology.
Great. Thank you for the question, and thank you for those responses. We'll finish up with Mary Jelinek with the last question. Mary, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and questions too. I look forward to reading the book. Just visually and biologically, this reminds me of something that Sister Carol Costin says, which is that life is found in the margins. You can be by a strip of mown grass and think that that's the reality of the world, and yet you're missing so much. What's happening in the unmown meadow beside the strip of grass is where all life is flourishing, and that is the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great way to end this time. Yeah.
Yeah, and to quote the great Carol Costin, one of the closest friends of water in the world, actually. She also uses that analogy, Mary, to talk about the sand. You know, as the waves come in and that water that is right at the edge of the sand, and how fertile and rich that particular place can be. Carol Costin, the great Adrian Dominican sister, who was the founding director of Network, the social justice lobby, now referred to as Nuns on the Bus by many people, but the original director of Water, the founding director, is the great Carol Costin, who also moved from that work into permaculture and did a lot of work for many years on a farm in Texas. One of the great women of our time. I wish you were with us. She could be on here. Maybe next week we'll get her on.
Gary, you just misspoke. You called Carol the founding director of Water.
I'm sorry, founding director. Oh my God, the founding director of Network. And the reason pardon my mistake, and thanks for correcting it. She also shared the Water office with us when she founded another project called Partners for the Common Good, which is a revolving loan fund of microcredit for women. And so I think of her again as one of the great leaders of our time, who was working in an intersectional way long before many of us could spell the words. So thank you, Mary Jelinek, and thank you, Carol Costin. And with that,
I thank our founding board, by the way.
That's right. I thank Susan and Grace for this wonderful hour. Many people have remarked on it already, both in the comments and elsewhere. So we thank you. We will again promote the book, which is Intersectional Theology. And this is an introduction to intersectional theology. And I think people will really understand from this conversation how important it is to have this kind of work. And one of the things that the authors modestly left out was that they asked very good questions at the end of each chapter, and they include a very useful bibliography. So again, it's a wonderful resource to use with your local groups, and I highly recommend that. This talk will be available, thanks to Laura, on our website shortly in some form, probably the audio as well as notes. And we will send you, Grace and Susan, our notes so that you can correct those or add any additional materials you'd like to go into the notes section. And those, I can assure you, those parts of our website are very, very well used. So upcoming water programs, we will have tea tomorrow, as I mentioned, with Rita Brock, Clark Pouilon, and Mary Condren, talking about what inspires them and what strategies they prioritize moving ahead in this very liminal time. On Monday next week, I'll do a meditation on swimming, which no bathing suits needed, will be at 7:30. And those who are regulars in our meditation will know that this is always a wonderful monthly time to get together and to talk briefly about a theme, and then to engage in 20 or more minutes of communal silence and then some conversation. But the theme will be swimming. Then on our Tuesday tea, as I mentioned earlier, next week, not tomorrow, but a week, we will have Marie Fortune and Emily Cohen, Faith Trust Institute people, some of the best in the business on the question of domestic and sexual violence, which we take very seriously, particularly during the pandemic. And then our next regular Water Talk will be next Wednesday. These are normally at the beginning of the month, so this month it's the end of the month, but May it'll be the beginning, so they're all kind of compressed. But we will have with us Gina Hens Piazza from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, who's the author of the Lamentations series, Lamentations book on the Wisdom Commentary series. And she will be talking, in fact, about silence breakers, woman, Zion, and the Me Too movement, looking at Lamentations 2:20. So that'll be very interesting. And then Diane New and our water staff on the 19th at 7:30 in the evening will present the monthly water ritual, You Are the Salt of the Earth, at 7:30 p.m. The Water Talk will be at this time, but it's always on Wednesdays except for today. So that's a lineup. All these programs are on our website, and we usually send a follow-up to these, so we'll send you the programs as well. With that, I want to again thank Susan and Grace for this rich hour and for your book, and wish you well on the project that you're working on, which we very much need. So thank you to them, and thank you to all of you for being part of this. Have a great time the rest of the day. Be safe, be healthy, be well. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary, for all your work and having us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Bye, Grace.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Take good care. Be safe.
Yep. Thank you, Laura. Thanks to everyone for participating and for all the questions and the comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura.